imagine that we have several baskets of goods. Rationality assumes that the individual can choose among these baskets even though they contain different quantities of each good. So suppose we had bundle A that had more of good X and less of good Y, and bundle B with less of good X and more of good Y. Either the individual can prefer and would prefer bundle A over bundle B, or bundle B over bundle A, or alternatively, the individual would be considered to be indifferent between the two bundles. This means that the two bundles gives him or her equal levels of satisfaction. Suppose there were three bundles, A, B, and C. The individual then can rank these three bundles. A is preferred to B is preferred to C, and if the individual expresses a preference for A over B and B over C, then in economics we would come to the conclusion, this is how we draw conclusions, that a rational person given A and C will choose A. Since A is preferred to B and B is preferred to C, then A is preferred to C. This is considered to be rational behavior. If the individual is indifferent between B and C, then if he prefers A to B, then he should prefer A to C. And this should make sense. We say that the individual can rank her preferences, and if every point on the two-dimensional plane XY is a bundle that can be considered, a rational individual should be able to rank all possible bundles in this space, and therefore we say this individual is rational because the individual can rank all of the baskets and all the bundles that are available to him or her. Either one is preferred to the other, it's inferior to the one, or you're indifferent. We generally join the indifferent bundles with something called an indifference curve, and the indifference curve basically says the individual is indifferent amongst these alternative bundles. The simplest way to interpret neoclassical economics rationality assumption is that if given bundles, the individual can rank these bundles, and in general, the rule is that more is preferred to less. So if one basket has more of both goods than the other, it should be easily concluded that the individual prefers the basket that has more of both goods over the basket that has less of both goods. So we get the idea of how rationality works. We talked about the indifference for bundles that are different, where there's no clear ranking. In the individual's mind, he or she can actually work out the ranking. The idea of rationality and rational self-interest says that the individual can rank all of these and knows exactly what she wants and will always choose what makes him or her happiest. Let's talk about other countries. We are going to say that individuals in all countries are rational. And the behavior should be the same, except that there are times that we see individuals in other countries, let's say poorer countries, making choices that a Westerner might not consider to be in the person's best interest. Either the individual is being rational and it is in their interest, we just perceive of the satisfaction differently, or alternatively the individual is not suffering in making her choices. So the idea of rational self-interest might be stretched a little to try to explain behavior in some poor countries, especially where men's preferences outrank women's preferences. Let's continue to talk about operating in the interests of others. In cultures where wives are expected to do things that are in their husband's interests and their in-laws' interests, then we see women making decisions that we might perceive not to be rational for the women as sovereign agents. So when the mother-in-law makes the decision, the mother-in-law criticizes or controls the situation, then we have to ask the question, is this rational by the standards of their culture? Is it rational by Western standards? We are not allowed to assume irrationality. So what we could say is that individuals have a bounded rationality or a constrained rationality. Let me talk about the concept of property. When I was a student, I took a class in law and economics, and it was a class taught by my favorite professor, and he was also the author of the textbook. So one of the first topics we studied was property, and I fell in love with the concept of property based on that one lecture. Nowadays, as we think of property, we probably know how to view property more broadly than many other people in the past. But the main point I want to make is that sometimes when we think of property, we think of stuff, physical stuff. However, younger generations are familiar with property that is not as tangible, intellectual property, property in things that aren't physical, so we get a clearer sense as to what property really ought to be. So I checked my dictionary when I was a student for the definition of property. And it said that property was a bundle of rights. At that point, I wrote down 6 rights that I thought were important. The right to own, the right to possess, the right to use, the right to transfer, the right to transform, the right to exchange. There are more rights, obviously. So let us try to think through some of this. You may own a car. Ownership of the car doesn't give you the right to operate the car in a way that breaks the laws of society. You don't have the right to speed. You don't have the right to drive in the wrong direction on the freeway or the wrong side of a 2-lane highway. The rights you have are bounded and controlled by society so that society can benefit from your ownership. You can benefit from your ownership so society can be better organized. Let's think about another one of these 6 definitions or aspects of rights. The right to transfer. Some property does not embody the right to transfer. So you cannot transfer your citizenship to someone else. Or the right to exchange. You can't exchange your citizenship with someone else. You can't say, I'll trade you my American citizenship for your Australian citizenship. All property, therefore, does not embody the same bundle of rights. There's some things that you can transfer to others and other things you can't transfer. So all of the rights that are embodied in you and your own life, many of these things cannot be passed on to your children or transferred to another generation. Some things can be transferred and others cannot be transferred. Transferred intergenerationally or transferred to someone else. Many things cannot be transferred. So as you think about this concept of property, I would like for you to think about property that is shared. I should have made a bigger deal about this. Common property. Common property means that you are sharing the rights. And I think I did mention in the past that sometimes when we are sharing the rights, we don't treat the property the same way as when we own the rights exclusively. So in the past I have said about the supermajority situation that if one individual in the society had actually owned the exclusive rights to the pipes, then the problem of having no water piped into the village for several years would never have occurred. That individual who owned the rights would have found a way to solve the problem, even if he did it at a price that caused other people not to want to participate. But the problem would have been solved because somebody views this as a revenue stream, and therefore he would have taken care of business. Because they shared ownership, no one wanted to make the investment in fixing the problem, because if you bore the costs and others got the benefits, then it didn't seem as though it was fair. This does seem to suggest that self-interest rules in many societies. And you might say, well, it is not self-interest that caused the problem to exist. It could be a lack of information. But I still make the point that if somebody had owned the property rights, the problem would have been solved faster. Think about what happened as a result of not fixing the problem with the pipes. Individuals went back to the behavior they exhibited before the pipes were put in. Went back into the forest to forage, went back to the land to do things that they shouldn't have done. It just created more problems because individuals were looking out for themselves. And you might say it's the poorest people in society who would do this. Yes, that's perfectly reasonable because they don't have the resources. They need to fix their problems, so by any means necessary. They don't have as much value for the environmental issues when they're starving. In the video, it was mentioned that the real problem in Sukumatri was poverty. And the poorest people will solve their problems because nobody else is helping them to solve their problems.